college training or anything before going to the police academy?
Well, not before the police academy. I had, right out of high school, I went into the Army. I was in the U.S. Army Infantry, and when I got out, I then applied directly to the Daytona Beach Community College Police Academy.
Completed that and then been in law enforcement ever since?
Correct.
And you've discussed your career with George Zimmerman, have you not?
In detail.
And it was actually you who assisted him when he decided that he needed a firearm, correct?
That is correct.
And did he tell you the reason why he wanted to get a firearm?
He asked whether he should or shouldn't to start with,
Okay.
and I recommended that he should. That anybody who's a non-convicted felon should carry a firearm.
That's your sort of life philosophy?
That's my opinion. Correct.
Being armed is better than not being armed?
The police aren't always there.
And you then encouraged him to do that?
I told him if he wished to go to a place that actually trains for the concealed weapons permit and to get that training.
Which you know that he did, right?
He did do.
And that he actually got his concealed weapons permit?
I believe him and his wife.
Okay. And then they need to decide what weapon that they should or he should purchase, correct?
That is correct.
And did he seek your counsel in that regard?
He did.
And
Object is to beyond the scope of direct.
Sustained.
okay. Let's focus then a bit more. How long did you know George?
About 5 years. Oh, at that time, it was about 4 years at that time.
Okay. And I think you said he's your best friend?
Best one I've ever had.
Would that affect in any way your testimony here today, that he's a good friend of yours?
Well, not as far as the truth is.
Okay. So you're going to speak the truth, good or bad, for Mr. Zimmerman?
Correct.
And as part of that friendship, you were contacted on the night that this event happened?
I was.
Okay. And offered your help, went and I guess helped Shelley, who was going through what she was going through, right?
Near hysterical. She had called me she was visiting her father's home at the time when she received a call from a neighbor from Twin Lakes. And then she immediately called me. And both of us got into our vehicle and arrived at Twin Lakes about within 10 seconds of each other.
And how upset was she?
Indescribably hysterical. She had almost no information to go on because the neighbor, I guess, that called, they had to hang up. So she couldn't get further updates as to George's health or status or what he had. She was, I put my arm around her just to kind of keep her from blacking out, I guess.
Because at that point, she had gotten a phone call from somebody who actually said that George was involved in a shooting, correct?
She told me that she got a call that said George was involved in a shooting, in handcuffs, and bloody.
So you arrive at the area, the complex where it happened, meet with Shelley.
Correct.
Did you see George at that point?
We walked up to where the yellow crime scene tape was that was surrounding. It was a massive area that they had circled off, so we couldn't get very close to the actual scene itself. But inside the crime scene tape was a Sanford police officer car. In the back seat of the police officer car, Shelley and I saw someone who she more quickly identified as probably being George lean his head down and lay down from the back seat. And supposedly he had laid straight down to where no one could see him. And
did you have any contact with him at that point?
None. Couldn't get anywhere close.
Okay. Then at some point you went to Sanford Police Department, correct?
Correct. I drove Shelley over to the Sanford Police Department and we waited in their lobby until he was released.
Do you recall about how many hours you were there?
Goodness. 2 or 3 a.m. Could have been even longer.
What was his state of mind when you finally saw him at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning?
Stunned. He immediately attempted to reassure Shelley, who broke down again once she saw him. Once they got out of the elevator, She went into hysterics, kind of a breakdown, maybe not hysterics, but went into a sobbing breakdown. And he immediately tried to reassure her he was okay, and so he was more occupied with her than with anything else. But he had a stunned look on his face.
And when you say stunned, tell the jury.
Wide-eyed, just kind of a little bit detached, perhaps from maybe not realizing he had just gone through a traumatic event. Odd to describe, very, very difficult to describe it.
Let's talk about, obviously, as a good friend for him for the 5 years prior, or 4 years prior, you've known him, correct?
Oh, yes.
And then tell the jury, if you would, how he was that night compared to the George Zimmerman you knew most other days.
That's what I was using to base my observation on, was a more wide-eyed stare. Again, once he saw Shelley, he focused more on making sure she was reassured, and that letting her know that he's okay, he doesn't have anything fatal or anything going on with him. He's all right. And she immediately started to observe. Once she got out of her shock at seeing George, she then started kind of looking at his injuries, and I guess she kind of went into nurse mode at that point because she was a nursing student.
And again, how is George presenting himself to you?
Detached. It's hard to describe.
Well, is detached different from the way he normally is?
Oh, vastly.
So when you say detached, what do you mean?
I would say probably when you feel like you've, it's hard to describe, sir. I would say he was probably in a position where he was not able to process. His mind wasn't, he wasn't answering questions, because I started asking him some questions about whether he needed to sit down for a little bit, right there in the lobby, and he didn't. He just, no, I just want to go. I just want to go home, kind of thing. And it was very basic. I don't know how to really describe detached, as in wide-eyed and really not processing what was going on.
Did he seem to you to be non-emotional about what was going on?
Coming right off of the elevator, well, he was tending to Shelley and her sobbing and her crying. So he was focused with that. When that went down, when Shelley actually transformed from a wife concerned for her husband to being a nurse, that's when he kind of just had a blank stare.
And then at some point you guys got in the car, correct?
Went to my vehicle, correct?
And then let's talk about the conversations that he did have with you. So
Right.
give us the setting, if you would, as to how this conversation that at some point in the future you relayed
Okay.
as far as your direct examination. So sort of give us the setting for what happened.
Okay. We get into my vehicle. Both Shelley and George got into the back seat. I had a four-door vehicle. They both got in the back seat, and Shelley is trying to put an assessment on the injuries that were to George's nose, the back of his head, and he had a swelling on his left side of his head. It was about the size of your fist. It was a swollen area, not really a goose egg, not as pronounced as that, but it was a very big swollen area. I'm sorry. And with his head being, his hair being closely cropped like mine, you could see it very well. I guess if he had a lot more hair, he would not have been able to see it as well. But she started tending to that, stating that we needed to get ice on it and such. And when we got stating that she needed to get ice on that part of the swelling, and on the drive from the Sanford Police Department to my home, he explained from start to finish. It took about the whole time that we went from the Sanford Police Department to my home. He explained what had happened that night, because that was the first time we had known any details of anything.
Now, as he was explaining it to you, was this sort of as a friend recounting to a friend, or were you acting in law enforcement mode or as friend mode?
Well, my wife will tell you it's hard for me to get out of law enforcement mode sometimes, but I like to analyze everything I hear to make sure that it makes sense. But I would say part of his friend also.
Okay, so let's start off then, not to belabor too much with keeping in mind your direct testimony, but let's start with, he first told you he was on his way to Super Target.
Correct.
Did that seem usual or unusual to you?
Every single Sunday like clockwork.
And tell me what he said to you about him first noticing who later became known to all of us as Trayvon Martin.
He observed Trayvon walking between two sets of townhomes and looking into, I believe there was a window to one where the light was on, and you could see that someone was looking into the window of a townhome. And it was about that time that Trayvon and George made eye contact with each other, and both aware of the other's presence.
Okay. And in that initial contact, did he seem to you as though he was angry or anything like that with who this person was?
No. George said that he wanted to make sure that he just got with non-emergency dispatch and had them send a police officer.
And he told you he did that?
Immediately.
And of course, you know from your conversation with George that that entire conversation was recorded, correct?
Yes, I do.
And from your conversations with George, both about this night and other nights, George Zimmerman certainly knows that those phone calls are recorded, correct?
Yes.
So tell me then, again, he's explained to you that Trayvon Martin is now walking up and sort of near his vehicle at some point?
Correct. Came walking from between the townhomes down to where the sidewalk or the road area was.
And are you taking any notes at this point, or are you just listening to him download?
I'm driving.
Okay. So at some point, it became apparent to you that Mr. Zimmerman had stopped his car by the clubhouse, correct?
Yes, he did.
And that Trayvon Martin then came up towards his car, either looked in a window or walked partially around it?
Very close, walked around it, very close. They made eye contact several more times, very aware of each other's presence.
During this point, this sort of second eye contact, did George Zimmerman relate to you in any way that he was angry or
No.
anything about Trayvon Martin or this person who was there?
No, not at all.
And he further told you that he was still on the phone, of course, with non-emergency, right?
He remained on, correct.
So then we move forward to, I think you said that George Zimmerman did what he thought he should to keep Trayvon Martin in sight?
Correct.
Is that pretty much the way? Tell me how he related that part to you, as best you can recall.
Well, he said that he had heard from the Sanford police officers that showed up to the clubhouse to give instruction to neighborhood watch people was to always try to keep whatever subject that you're observing in sight. It makes it much easier for a law enforcement officer to show up and make contact with the subject if you're on the phone with dispatch during the whole process and you can actually see the subject.
Did he relate to you that the non-emergency dispatcher had actually told him on a couple of occasions, tell me what he's doing now or let me know if he's doing anything else?
He told me what he was doing. He didn't tell me that the dispatcher had said certain things.
Okay. So basically, George Zimmerman, as he's telling you this story, is recounting to you actions, correction?
Yes.
Correct?
Oh, yes.
Not necessarily, I did this because of this reason, or I did this, and sort of superimposing the conversation he's having with the non-emergency onto your conversation.
No, not at that time, no.
Okay. He was just saying basically a rendition of what was going on.
Correct.
And just so the jury is clear, about how long was this conversation between George Zimmerman and you during this car ride?
The drive from the Sanford Police Department to near the intersection of Reinhardt Road and Lake Mary Boulevard, which would have been about 14 minutes, 15 minutes.
And during that time, were other things being discussed as well, like whatever Shelley was doing with him?
She didn't interject at all.
Okay. So during this conversation then, he's telling you that he's trying to keep an eye on Trayvon Martin however he can.
That was
correct?
his intent,
Okay.
was to keep him under observation.
And at some point, well, tell me then, at some point did he say to you, That I couldn't see him any longer, or that he lost sight of him?
That is one of the reasons why he got out of the vehicle.
And tell me how he related that to you?
He said he went in between the sets of townhomes down a dog path, a walking path.
When you say he, you mean Trayvon Martin?
What? Right. He lost contact in the darkness in between the townhomes down that walking path, and then he got out of his vehicle it may have been at the time when someone was asking him, where's your exact location, because the officer was getting close. So as the police officer gets closer and closer to the actual scene, the dispatch likes to tell them exact street numbers so you can find your place exactly.
Okay.
So that's what he was looking for.
George Zimmerman never told you during the entirety of this conversation that George Zimmerman ever went down the dog path, correct?
He did. He left his vehicle and he
walked down the path.
Walked down the path, correct.
Do you know this area that we're talking about?
I do.
Okay. And you know there's a path that goes straight through to Retreat View Circle?
Correct.
And then a right turn that goes off to the right?
Correct.
A T.
Yes.
And he had said to you that Trayvon Martin went down the T, correct?
Perhaps, yes. That's what he believes, because the street beyond was lit better than the dog path was. So if Trayvon had gone all the way to Retreat View Circle, he would have seen him or his shadow, perhaps. Because he lost sight of him around the time where the T was, he said, I believe he made his turn down that dark dog path area that was not very well lit at all.
And tell us the path, if you recall, that George Zimmerman told you he took as he was on the phone.
He said he went straight to go through since he lost contact. He wanted to go straight through to get a house number of one
straight
of the
through,
straight through, not take the right to go down on the T, just to go straight through and find some kind of a house number, because you want to make sure you get the exact house number, because there was a lot of units there on Retreat View Circle. The exact house number would have brought the police officer faster. I believe that's what his intent was.
And he told you that he was on his way back when the altercation began, correct?
Correct.
And that they said whatever they said to each other that you testified to. Just to fast forward, I think you said that you weren't taking notes during that event, correct?
I was driving, correct.
Have you ever talked to George again about the facts of this case, or was that the only time?
One other time, I heard him relay the incident.
And when was that?
The next morning.
Okay, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
During the event in the car, when he said things like, do you have a problem, you do now, or no, I don't, are those, as best you can recall, the words that George told you he remembered from the night before?
That is correct.
And talking about the actual mounting, when he said that Trayvon Martin had mounted him, I think he said that at one point he was straddling him and the knees may have been up as high as the armpits. Is that correct?
Could have been. The ribs area could have been as high as the armpits.
Well, no, I'm just asking
Yes.
you, because what I would like to do is have you tell the jury, without presuming or suggesting ribs, armpits, hips, knees, whatever it might be, for right now, just recount, as best you recall, what George remembered of the event and what he told you.
Well, I guess during a struggle, I guess the position of his knees and legs would probably change with George squirming. So at one point, I believe they were around his ribs, with George trying to squirm off of the sidewalk and onto the grass. I guess his knees came up a little higher, and that's very possible. Or the other way around, to where it was as he's squirming, once they get closer to the grass, in a fight, I guess, or in a scrap like that, it began at least here with the ribs, where the knees are somewhere in the ribs area.
Was he consistent, however, that it was Trayvon Martin who had mounted on top of him?
If it was Trayvon that did
yes.
it? Oh, absolutely.
And was he consistent that it was he, meaning George Zimmerman, who was screaming for help?
Without question.
And he did tell you at some point that there was some hand over the nose, hand over the mouth event?
Correct. But it was raining and it was slippery, I'm sure.
Did he tell you how long that portion of the overall altercation lasted?
20 seconds maybe, 15, 20, 30 seconds.
Did he-
He didn't mention it.
Well, again, I don't want you to
No,
sort of
he didn't mention
assume.
it. He did not say how long.
Okay. Did that, however, as he related it to you, seem to be significant as it was occurring to him, that he couldn't breathe for whatever length of time?
It was critical.
And that somebody had a hand, Trayvon Martin, on the nose that had already suffered the previous injury?
Correct.
And as he was relating that to you, was that sort of a real focus of his?
That was the focus. That when he was losing oxygen, he felt he was not able to breathe, and that's why he was desperate to either clear an airway.
And in your experience as law enforcement, would you agree that that's sort of a natural reaction to traumatic events?
I would think so, every time I've seen it.
And do people involved in traumatic events like that sometimes focus on particular parts of it?
Almost exclusively to the omission of others.
For example, a car accident, you might focus on the speed of the car coming at you and completely forget about other cars around you.
Correct.
Is that unnatural in your experience as law enforcement?
No, it's typical.
So when you go to a scene of an accident or shooting or just anything that you investigate, do you find in your experience that people often have sort of tunnel vision views of what happened to them?
Sometimes very specific, correct.
Does that mean that they're lying to you when they do that?
Not at all.
Why not?
It's been proven that is typical. Sometimes they'll focus in on one event to the exclusion of others.
How about their ability to just recount events with any particularity at all?
I'm going to object this beyond the scope of the direct. I haven't objected previously.
It's the same.
And then you testified concerning this whole event around the gun. Did you have a similar concern as to Mrs. Zimmerman's ability to recount those events to you?
No.
Okay. Tell me what he did say about having to grab his gun.
He said that Trayvon had reached down and grabbed for the gun, whether it was on the leather holster or on the actual metal part itself. At the time, I didn't see a difference. I just thought that the intent was clear, and that's when he freed one of his hands and went and got the gun. He either broke contact or knocked somebody else's hand away, or Trayvon's hand away from him reaching for the gun or grabbing the gun, and then he drew it.
Do you recall if he even told you that Trayvon Martin had touched the gun, or just that he was reaching for it?
I thought he had said he had grabbed the gun. I've only heard the story twice, and whether it was grabbed the gun, grabbed for the gun, perhaps it was just the intent. But I believed he said he grabbed the gun.
So, and then he told you the rest of the story as you related, correct?
Yes, sir.
About Trayvon Martin sort of saying something to him. Did that seem unusual to you, that someone shot could still say something?
Yes. Oh no, that's very, very common. Unless you're shot in, let's say, the windpipe and in the vocal cords, you would be able to talk for maybe 6 to 8 seconds.
Nonetheless, that George Zimmerman said that he had gotten off and actually held his hands out away from his body.
He had gotten off of George, laid down on the grass, and George had jumped on top of him to pin his hands down and to, again, try to solicit some help from people that are around.
And yet, when he let the hands go, Trayvon Martin may have brought them back under him. Was that the way it was presented to you?
No.
Speculation.
Oh,
I apologize, I withdraw it.
yeah. No.
Did he even did George Zimmerman even know to talk to you about the fact that Trayvon Martin's hands were found back under his body?
I did not know that fact.
Okay. So he didn't seem to feel any need to explain that away to you, correct?
Correct.
So now let's talk about your recounting this. Well, you said that you heard a story again the next day.
the next morning.
Any differences in what we've talked about so far?
None.
Okay, and who was that discussed with or in front of?
My wife and his wife, Shelley.
And was it different in any context when it was being discussed then?
George looked different. He was not as wide-eyed, and he did not appear to be as in shock the next morning.
Now, let's fast forward. How many months until you decided to recount this in a book form?
I have to look. At least 4 months.
Okay. Did you have any conversation with Mr. Zimmerman to corroborate that what you recalled happened or what you recall him telling you happened was in fact accurate?
We were not able to contact each other after he was arrested the first time. So there was no contact.
All right. And so you haven't talked to him, you haven't shown him, for example, a draft of the book and say, I remember you saying this, and him saying, no, that I said this instead.
There was no cooperation with that, no.
Yeah. This is your memory 4 months later when you looked back to that night, correct?
Correct.
And just remember it as best you can 4 months later.
Correct.
You didn't take any notes that night,
None.
nor in between, did you?
No.
So it wasn't until 4 months later that you went back, sort of scoured your memory to put back together what he had told you on that night, 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th.
Unfortunately, I did not take any notes, so it was just memory.
Okay. If you had any facts wrong that were conclusively proven wrong by forensic evidence, would you defer to the evidence rather than your memory of it?
Without question.
If, for example, he told you he shot once and there were 4 shots fired, and you had in your book that there was 1, but the forensic evidence supported 4, you would defer to that?
I'd support that 100%.
And to the extent that he may have told you something, well, you remember he told you something differently than it appears in the non-emergency call, which is recorded contemporaneous with the event, you would defer to that?
Absolutely. I may have heard wrong, or I may have documented it wrong.
And even if there was something different that he told law enforcement a few hours earlier in a recorded or videotaped interview from what you recall happening, would you defer to that?
I would.
A moment, Your Honor. And at some point during this investigation, you had an opportunity to listen to the screaming on the 911 call, correct?
Beyond the scope of the record.
Sustained.
Then no other questions from me.
Can you redirect?
As you stated, the defendant never told you that the victim had his hands underneath his body after he shot him. He said he put his hands out, right?
Correct.
And as you stated, the defendant told you that the victim, Trayvon Martin, grabbed his gun, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Grabbed for his gun.
Well, I think you've actually,
Grabbed, right. Whether it was, again, I guess we're going over whether he grabbed the holster part or the gun. I didn't see a difference in the two, but grabbed something.
grabbed the gun. He didn't.
Absolutely. The gun didn't come out, but he
No,
grabbed the gun in the holster.
that's what I'm saying.
Yes, sir.
The defendant didn't tell you, Mr. Zimmerman didn't tell you he grabbed for it. He said he actually got it.
That's what I heard. That's what I thought I heard, yes.
Right, okay. Then he told you, I thought I shot wide, but he might get up, so I put my gun in my holster.
Correct.
And he said he put the phone in his pocket, turned around to head back, and the guy was right there about 15 feet walking towards him.
Correct.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very brief, one question in response. As to the reholstering of the weapon, do you recall if he told you that it was reholstered as he got up, or if he had it in his hand when he was holding Trayvon Martin's hands down, or even at some point shortly thereafter?
He may have had it. He may have had it still in his hand as he jumped on top of Trayvon, and perhaps holstered when he saw the flashlight. I don't remember specifically when exactly he holstered his firearm.
Thank you. Nothing further on.
You wrote in the book that he holstered his firearm.
He holstered his firearm at some point. Exactly when, I'm not 100% sure whether it was when he got up from, whether he stood up and reholstered, or whether he holstered while still partially on top.
Right, you want to look at your book a minute, if you could, page 29 at the bottom. Did you quote him as saying, "In fact, I thought he might try to get up again, so after putting my gun in my holster, I jumped on top of him and pinned his wrist to the ground"?
Correct.
Okay,
What-
was that accurate?
As far as I remember, that he holstered, yeah, at that point, it now remembers that, I remember that it was, he holstered, pinned his hands down. It's what I remembered him saying something like that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. May Mr. Osterman be excused?
To remain under our subpoena, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. You're excused from the courtroom, but you're subject to being recalled. Are we ready to bring the jury in?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, let's go ahead and bring them in.
Next witness is going to be actually the plan of the Hannity interview. We had an instruction prepared regarding that redaction. I've got my copy here.
I'll take your copies then. It should be this here. You're welcome. Please be seated. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. During the lunch hour, if your answer is yes to any of my questions, please raise your hand. During the lunch hour, did any of you have any discussions amongst yourselves or with anybody else about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you use any type of an electronic device to go on the internet to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology? No hands are being raised. And finally, did any of you read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, blogs, or social networking pages about the case? No hands are being raised. Thank you very much. Mr. De La Rianda?
Your Honor, at this time, we would formally play the Hannity interview on July 18th, 2012, and I think there's a preliminary instruction, of course.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, at the direction of the court, certain portions of the defendant's interview with Sean Hannity on July 18th, 2012 have been excised or redacted based upon legal determinations made by the court. The parts excised or redacted are not relevant, and you are not to concern yourselves with why this occurred or with the content of any excised or redacted portions. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. This, for the record, states Exhibit 180.
And tonight, in an interview that you will only see right here on Hannity, George Zimmerman, the man charged with second-degree murder of Trayvon Martin, breaks his silence. Now, earlier today, I traveled to Seminole County, Florida. Let's go back to the night of the shooting. Take us back to that night. You were going to the store. Let's start at the beginning.
I was going to Target to do my weekly grocery shopping. Sunday nights was the only nights, well, Sunday after we mentored the kids, we would always go grocery shopping and do our cooking for the week. So I wanted to go to Target, and I headed out, and that's the last time I've been home.
Since that, you never went back since that day. Then we all have heard the 911 call. On that 911 call, you had mentioned that there had been a number of break-ins in the neighborhood. Why were you a community watch person? How long were you involved in that, and why did you become a community watch person?
In August of 2011, there was a home invasion. A young lady was home with her 9-month-old baby, and they broke in her sliding glass door. She barricaded herself in the upstairs bedroom, and my wife was home by herself, and she saw the people that burglarized her run through our backyard with their belongings. And even though my wife wasn't certain what happened, that was enough to scare her and shake her up. And I promised her I would do what I could to keep her safe.
Your gun was legal. You had a legal weapon in the state of Florida.
Yes, sir.
Why did you feel the need to carry a gun? A lot of people maybe have a weapon inside their home, but you decided to carry yours. Why did you think it was necessary to have a weapon with you, and did you carry it at all times?
I carried it at all times except for when I went to work.
Yeah. A lot of this case legally has to do with stand your ground. You've heard a lot about it, and I was just curious, prior to this night, this incident, had you even heard stand your ground?
No, sir.
You'd never heard about it before?
No.
Wow. Now, it was very interesting, in the 911 call that everybody has heard, you said that all of a sudden you found somebody who looked suspicious, he may be on drugs. That was one of the earlier comments that you made in that 911 call. What made you think he was suspicious, and what made you think that he might be on drugs?
I felt like he was suspicious because it was raining. He was in between houses, cutting in between houses, and he was walking very leisurely for the weather. It didn't look like he was a resident that went to check their mail and got caught in the rain and was hurrying back home. He didn't look like a fitness fanatic that would train in the rain. He just seemed like...
Weren't there overhangs, though? He was walking, he wasn't standing still? And he was walking closer to the house, which is back from the sidewalk?
Yes, sir.
Am I understanding that right?
The overhangs are just in front of the front doors.
Yeah. You said he started from almost the beginning in that 911 call. You said he came towards you, and he seemed to reach for something in his waistband. Did you think that was a gun?
I thought he was just trying to intimidate me.
To make you think that there's a gun?
A weapon.
Of some kind?
Possibly.
You said in that tape, something's wrong with him, he's checking me out, I don't know what his deal was. So it's almost from the very beginning, you felt, are you saying on that 911 tape that you felt threatened at that moment when you said that to the dispatch?
No, not particularly.
What did you mean with, I don't know what his deal is, he's checking me out?
The way he was coming back, and I was on the phone, but I was certain I could see him saying something to me, and his demeanor, his body language was confrontational.
Do you remember what it was that you said specifically on the tape? Yeah. You said, then we get to the issue where you said on the 911 call that he's running. You said that to the dispatch. Is there any chance in retrospect, as you look back on that night and what happened, trying to maybe get into the mindset, because we also have learned that Trayvon was speaking with his girlfriend supposedly at the time, that maybe he was afraid of you, didn't know who you were.
No.
You don't think that, why do you think that he was running that?
Well, maybe I said running, but he was more...
You said he's running.
Yes. He was like skipping and going away quickly, but he wasn't running out of fear.
You could tell the difference?
He wasn't running.
So he wasn't actually running?
No, sir.
Okay, because that's what you said to the dispatcher, you thought he was running. Let me ask you this. At that point, we can hear the unbuckling of the seatbelt, hear you opening the car door.
I meant that I was
the dispatch asked you at that point, and this became a very key moment that everyone in the media focused on, and the dispatcher asked you, are you following him? And you said yes. Explain that.
I meant that I was going in the same direction as him to keep an eye on him so that I could tell the police where he was going. I didn't mean that I was actually pursuing him.
So this moment where some had suggested you were out of breath on that tape, you yourself were not running.
No, sir.
And you, I think, made a statement to the police that it was the wind as you were getting out of the car and moving, and that was the sound we hear, not you out of breath.
Yes, sir.
And welcome back to Hannity. We continue now with more of my exclusive interview with George Zimmerman and his attorney, Mark O'Mara. What did you do from that moment forward? Because this is where we get into this minute gap in this case. You know, and what did you do from that minute forward when the dispatch said, we don't need you to follow him? What did you do next?
I walked across the sidewalk onto my street, Retreat View Circle, where I thought I would meet a police officer that I had called.
So you did not continue to follow him at that point?
No, sir.
All right, so you continue from there. You sounded at that moment on the tape, though, a little bit distracted. What was the distraction? That you were looking for him, or?
I wanted to make sure that, I believe they asked me for my address, and I wanted to be sure that nobody was lingering and could hear my address and then come back. And I was making sure that there wasn't anybody that was going to surprise me, and just trying to give them an accurate location.
Because they said, you know, can we meet you here at a certain location? You said, have them call me.
Yes.
Why did you want them at that point to call you?
I hadn't given them correct address. I gave them the clubhouse vicinity. However, I was walking through to my street, Retreat View Circle, and I was going to give them the actual street number and name.
How long was it, George, after that you saw Trayvon again? Because you said you stopped, that you did not continue pursuing him. When did you next see Trayvon Martin?
Less than 30 seconds.
Okay. Where exactly were you at that point? And how far away were you from your car at that moment?
I'd guess about 100 feet or more.
So you never went further than how far approximately from your car?
I'd estimate it to be approximately 100 feet.
So you never went further than that from the car?
No, sir.
Okay. And so at that point, Trayvon is, all of a sudden you turned around and there he was?
Yes, sir.
What happened next?
He asked me what my problem was.
Expletive problem.
Yes, sir. And I was wearing a rain jacket, and I had put my cell phone in my jacket pocket as opposed to my jeans pocket where I normally keep it. And I immediately went to grab my phone to this time call 911 instead of the non-emergency. And when I reached into my pants pocket, because that's where I keep it out of habit, it wasn't there, and I was shocked. I looked up, and he punched me and broke my nose.
One shot.
Yes, sir.
So he said to you, you have expletive, you have a problem. Those were the exact words he used. You remember it?
Do you have a problem? What's your problem?
What's your problem? And you said to him, I don't have a problem.
Yes, sir.
You reached for your phone.
I reached for it as I was saying, no, I don't have a problem.
And at that point, you just got hit?
He was already within arm's length from me.
And was that the punch in the nose that broke your nose?
Yes, sir.
right there, and you went immediately down to the ground?
I don't remember if I went immediately to the ground or if he pushed me to the ground, but I ended up on the ground.
What do you remember happened from there? Because there were police reports and descriptions that you gave, and that you were a little bit dazed, obviously, and at one point you said that you wanted to stop him from hitting your head on the cement.
Yes, sir.
Is that what you told the police?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so after that first hit, what happened next?
He started bashing my head into the concrete sidewalk. As soon as he broke my nose, I started yelling for help. So I was disoriented, and he started slamming my head into the concrete.
Which is where the lacerations came from.
Yes, sir.
You said it was like your head was going to explode, was a comment that you had given to the police.
Yes, sir. He continued to punch me in the head.
How many times would you estimate that he punched you?
Several, more than a dozen.
And hitting you hard? At what moment could you said you feared for your life? At what moment do you remember when you literally, do you remember when you thought, I may die? Is that, because you said that you feared for your life. Do you remember the exact moment when you felt that?
In hindsight, I would say when he was slamming my head into the concrete and I thought I'd lose consciousness. I didn't know what would happen at that point.
And how close was the concrete to the grass? Because a big issue is also the grass stains that you had on your clothes. And you had made a statement to the police that you wanted to get to the grass. Was that to protect your head from getting banged into the cement again?
Yes, sir.
How close was that in proximity?
It butts up to the concrete.
And were you able to get to the grass?
Yes, sir.
And how did you do that?
I guess you could say shimmy. I mean, he was straddled on me with his full weight, and I would try and sit up and push myself down. And whenever I would sit up, that's when he would take the opportunity to slam my head back down and punch me in the head and continue to hit my nose.
Was he talking to you a lot during this fight, when he was beating you? Because you're saying he's beating you and pounding your head into the cement. Was he talking to you during that time?
Yes.
And he was saying?
Cursing, telling me to shut up, and then finally telling me he was going to kill me.
And he said those words. And he said it. When did he first see your gun?
After we were on the ground, I shimmied with him on top of me, and it made my jacket rise up. And he being on top of me saw it on my right side.
What happened after that?
I felt him take, he had, after he couldn't hit my head on the concrete anymore, he started to try to suffocate me. And I continued to push his hands off of my mouth and my nose, particularly because it was excruciating, having a broken nose and him putting his weight on it. And that's the point in time when he started telling me to shut up, shut up, shut up. And
why did he tell you to shut up?
I don't know.
We heard the screams on the one recording from a neighbor that was calling the police, and there's been some dispute whose voice that is. Was that your voice screaming, or was that Trayvon Martin's voice screaming?
That was my voice. Absolutely.
That was your voice?
Yes, sir.
And the police even said at one time they heard 14 screams. You were screaming that loud?
Yes, sir.
And you said to the police at one point that he put his hand over your mouth. Do you think that was to silence you from screaming?
Yes, sir. I believe he, from what the investigators told me, he knew that I was talking to the police, and I was yelling so that I believed that the police officer was there and they just couldn't find me. So I was yelling in the hopes that they were in the vicinity and they would come when they heard me yelling.
Do you remember when you yourself reached for your weapon? Do you remember that moment?
Yes, sir.
Tell us about that.
At that point, I realized that it wasn't my gun, it wasn't his gun, it was the gun.
Did he say anything? Because you said he was talking a lot about the gun. Did he say he noticed the gun?
He said, "You're gonna die tonight," and took one hand off of my mouth, and I felt it going down my chest towards my belt and my holster, and that's when I didn't have any more time.
Do you think you acted more out of a conscious thought? I mean, I know these events happen very quickly. Do you remember consciously thinking, I've got to grab my gun? Or did you just do it? Was there a conscious thought that went through your head that you thought you were going to die and that you had to take this, you had to get your weapon and fire?
I'd love to give you an answer.
You don't know.
It just happened so quickly.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was an eyewitness that was out from the very beginning that, in fact, did tell the police the night of the shooting that he saw Trayvon on top of you and did see the beating. There is no witness to the actual shooting itself. Right? Correct?
Besides myself.
Besides yourself.
Yes, sir.
When you think back, and there was one report or a police report that actually said you didn't know after you fired, you didn't think, you thought you missed?
Yeah, I didn't think I hit him, yes.
Yeah. So what happened immediately after the shooting then, George? I understand one guy came out, he said he had a flashlight, that he spoke to you, and you said to call your wife, tell her what happened, that I shot somebody. Do you remember that conversation?
The conversation I had with the gentleman, or?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You do remember that conversation. And he did talk about it, and what his suggestion is that you were very matter-of-fact about it. Do you remember what you said to him? Do you think you were in a state of shock? Did you know that when did you know that Trayvon had died?
When I went, probably about an hour after I got to the police station.
After the shooting, and you saw that he was laying there, and obviously injured, there was a moment where you realized that he was shot?
Like I said, he sat up and he said something to the effect of, "You got it," or "You got me." I assumed he meant, okay, you got the gun, I didn't get it, I'm not going to fight anymore. At which point, I got out from under him.
Is there anything you regret? Do you regret getting out of the car to follow Trayvon that night?
No, sir.
Do you regret that you had a gun that night?
No, sir.
Do you feel you wouldn't be here for this interview if you didn't have that gun?
No, sir.
You feel you would not be here?
I feel that it was all God's plan, and for me to second guess it or judge it.
Is there anything you might do differently in retrospect, now that time has passed a little bit?
No, sir.
You know, the detective said, that Detective Singleton said, he quoted you saying, the bad guys always get away. You also said that in the 911 tape. Did you have a feeling that there were a lot of people that do get away with crimes? In other words, were you sort of predisposed in your mind in some way to think that criminals get away too often?
Not in general. I think in our neighborhood, there's geographic advantages for burglaries.
Do you have any idea, why do you think Trayvon would have confronted you the way he did? I made a comment on the air one day, and I got beaten up pretty bad for saying this could have all just been a terrible misunderstanding or a mistake. Do you think maybe, is there any possibility he thought you were after him and you thought he was after you, and there was some misunderstanding in any way?
I've wrestled with that for a long time, but I can't. One of my biggest issues through this ordeal has been the media conjecture, and I can't assume or make believe.
The one witness that you first met, the guy with the cell phone that I mentioned, asked about your demeanor right after the shooting. He was the first person, I guess, on the scene?
Yes, sir.
First person you saw. And he said that you looked like you had been, quote, butt-whooped, like you had had a fight, and that you were asking, call my wife, just tell my wife. But, he was acting like it was nothing. Is that how you were feeling at the time? Because you didn't find out, you said, till later that Trayvon had passed away.
No, I knew that I had discharged my firearm, and I was scared, nervous, I also thought the police were going to come and see me with a firearm and shoot me. I mean, I was terrified.
Did you look over at Trayvon? You obviously at some point recognized he had been shot, because
Yes.
you didn't know it in the beginning. Did you look over at him at any time and realize he was in really bad shape?
No, sir.
At no point. And how long was it between the time you shot him to the time the police actually got to the scene?
It felt like forever. I'd say 15 to 30 seconds.
It was that quick?
Yes, sir.
Immediate. So in other words, they had already been on their way, and they were there within 15 and 30 seconds. What do you make of all the national media attention in this case? There are crimes that happen every day. The nation is focused on your case. Why do you think that is, and what do you make of it? And what does it mean to you?
It's surreal. I don't like that they've brushed to judgment the way they have. I feel that anytime they have a story that's remotely positive, they interpret it negatively.
You had called police on at least 4 prior occasions and had mentioned black male suspects. I wanted to give you a chance to respond. Why you called, what were those instances about?
They also stated that, and I never volunteered that information. It was always at their request that I described them, and even when I described them, I didn't volunteer the race until they asked me. And there was also Hispanic kids and white kids that were in the
That you
neighborhood.
made calls about?
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you this. I want to go back to one specific in the case, if I can. And it's the issue of you following him. And we heard, asked you earlier about the dispatch call, and you said you stopped, you didn't follow him. There's one moment that you were apparently, as you look at the grounds of where this took place, and there's the apartment, and there's the overhangs, and then there's another street on the other side, and you had gone to the other street, correct?
Yes, sir.
At some point. So how do you get to the other street if you're not following him? I mean, where were you going at that point?
I was walking from where I had parked my car towards my street. He went right down in between the houses. I walked straight across to.
When in that sense, were you following him?
No, sir.
You weren't following him?
No, sir.
And this is after the 911 call?
During
During the 911 call?
when they stated, "We don't need you to do
So why
that."
were you walking back to your street and not back to the car
I was
at that point? If I'm trying to get the chronology right.
certainly where I had parked my car was the back of townhouses. There wasn't a way to know what the street number was, and I knew if I walked straight through, it's a circle, Retreat View Circle. I knew if I walked straight through to there, that would be Retreat View Circle, and then I could tell them exactly what 1, 2, 3, 4 Retreat View Circle, and not just a general area of where my car was like I had done previously.
Call your next witness, please.
Dr. Valerie Rao.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony in these proceedings will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am. If you'd please tell the members of the jury your name.
Yes, my name is Dr. Valerie Rao. My last name is spelled R-A-O.
And how are you employed?
I'm the District 4 medical examiner.
And what comprises District 4?
District 4, we have 3 counties, Duval, Clay, and Nassau.
And are you the chief medical examiner in your district?
Yes, I am.
How long have you been a medical examiner in total?
32 years.
And are you also a licensed physician and surgeon?
Yes,
And how long have you been so licensed in the state of Florida?
since 1981.
Can you summarize for the members of the jury, please, your educational and professional background?
Yes, I got my degree in medicine in 1971, after which I went to London. I spent a year and a half doing pathology at 2 hospitals, one St. Heliers Hospital in South London and the other St. Andrews Hospital in East London. After which I came to the US and I did residency, 5 years totally. 2 years doing clinical pathology at Berkshire Medical Center, Pittsfield, Massachusetts. 2 years doing anatomic pathology in Albany Medical Center, Albany, New York. 1 year doing forensic pathology in Baltimore for the state of Maryland. I'm board certified in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology. I then spent a year in Tucson, Arizona, where I did medical examiner work. Sorry. I was medical examiner for a year. 1 year as medical examiner. After which I went to Miami, where I was an associate medical examiner for a total of 19 years. I then took a chief position in District 5, where I was there for 3 years. I went to the University of Missouri in Columbia, where I was associate professor for 2 years, and then came to Jacksonville, where I've been here for about 7 years.
And just briefly, what are your duties as a medical examiner?
In the state of Florida, we're required to investigate sudden, unexpected, unnatural death, and ultimately to sign the death certificate, the cause and manner of death.
What is meant by the term pathology?
Pathology is the study of disease in the human body.
And what is meant by forensic pathology?
So in forensic pathology, it comes under the umbrella where the sudden, unexpected, unnatural death cases come under the forensic pathologist.
And have you ever been qualified as an expert in the courts of the state of Florida in the field of forensic pathology?
Yes,
Approximately how many times?
hundreds of times.
Do you also have experience examining injuries to living people?
Yes.
And explain what that experience is.
Okay, so when I was in Miami, where I was an associate medical examiner, had the opportunity to work there at the Rape Treatment Center for 18 years, where I saw several thousand living patients, examination and treatment of these victims.
And what types of injuries would you see when examining those victims?
Okay, some of the patients that came were also physically assaulted. So there were injuries that come under the category of blunt force trauma. There were patients that were stabbed, so that's sharp force injury. Some of the patients were strangled but did not die. So we saw this gamut of cases in living patients.
And what are blunt force injuries?
So blunt force, the term is to distinguish it from sharp force, meaning that the instrument that's being used, for example, a bat would qualify as a blunt weapon. A stick, if I was to bump myself as I came in here on the corner of this table, I would suffer blunt injury if it was severe enough to cause injury. Whereas a sharp force is injury that is caused by a sharp weapon, a knife, a bottle that is broken and then the sharp edge used to inflict trauma. So this is the difference between sharp force and blunt force trauma.
Within blunt force trauma, are there different types of blunt force trauma?
Yes.
And what are those?
So the first part of it, let's look in progression of severity. A bruise, we're talking about a small bruise, is where the skin is intact and the blood vessels under the skin are injured and they bleed under the skin and get what you know as a bruise. The skin is intact. Then you have a scrape where the skin is compromised and it's, for example, a rug burn would qualify as an abrasion. Then you have the lacerations where not only the skin is torn, but the underlying tissue is also torn, exposed to the outside. And depending on the severity of the laceration, you will get varying degrees of bleeding and trauma.
All right. Are bruises also known as or referred to in your field as contusions?
Yes,
All right. And then scrapes is the same as a laceration?
abrasion.
I'm sorry, abrasion.
Yes.
And then there's lacerations?
Yes,
Okay.
which is basically, laceration is a tearing of tissue.
All right. Have you ever been qualified in the courts of the state of Florida as an expert in the area of conducting rape examinations and all manner of injuries associated with rape victims?
Yes,
And again, approximately how many times?
hundreds of times.
During your tenure as the medical examiner in Miami, did you also examine other categories or sets of living victims?
Yes.
And explain what you mean by that.
So, for example, somebody alleging police brutality, the medical examiner, we just were housed directly across a very large hospital in Miami, Jackson Memorial Hospital. So the police would ask if we could go and examine to see if the allegations were actually borne out by the trauma. So we would go across the street, we would photograph, we would put out a report, and those reports come under consultations. Also child abuse cases, especially if the clinical people thought that the child was going to die, they would ask us to come and take the photographs and do the interpretation. So we basically practiced forensic medicine, not really forensic pathology, where you're only looking at dead people.
You know, at this time I would tender Dr. Rao as an expert in the area of pathology and forensic pathology.
I don't think that's necessary under the current case law in this state. So,
She'll be able to testify in those areas.
Thank you, Your Honor. Were you asked to examine some evidence in the state of Florida versus George Zimmerman?
Yes.
And specifically, what were you provided in regards to that case?
Okay. So I was given a whole series of things that I asked for the whatever is available, because I'd like to do the consult, having as much as possible in the database before I formulated an opinion. So what I received was a reenactment of the incident involving the fatal shooting. This was recorded on the 27th of February 2012. I got a set of 36 photographs taken of Mr. Zimmerman, documenting the clothing, the injuries, the medical records from the Altamont Family Practice Clinic. And of course, there were two records from this clinic. One was on the 27th of February, and the other one was on the 9th of March, 2012. I got a DVD labeled Sanford PD Lobby and Others. It showed the vehicle going to the police department and Mr. Zimmerman being taken by the police into the department to be booked. A DVD labeled Medical Examiner Report and Photographs. And this included the medical examiner report, the body diagrams, the autopsy photographs. 26 autopsy photographs were taken, the toxicology report, and then a report that states two individuals were involved in a physical altercation in the yard, and one of them fired a handgun, and the decedent fell to the ground. And the other items in the same folder were the medical examiner autopsy report, the toxicology report. So this is what I received.
Did you also receive two photographs of the defendant at the scene the night of the event?
Yes.
And when you said reenactment, when you referred to the reenactment, was that an interview where he conducted a walkthrough and led investigators through the scene and explained to them what happened?
Yes.
After reviewing all of those items, in terms of severity, how would you classify the injuries to the defendant's head?
They were not life-threatening. They were very insignificant. They did not require any sutures to be applied to Mr. Zimmerman. So, as I will refer to them, insignificant injuries.
Did you observe any lacerations to the back of the defendant's head?
Yes.
How many?
2.
And were those lacerations depicted in the photographs that you reviewed?
Yes. They were. There was bleeding, so I was not able to look at them after they were cleaned, because subsequently when he went to the Altamont clinic, they were covered by Band-Aids.
And were you also provided the reports from the Altamont Family Springs Clinic describing the injuries as they were viewed by a physician's assistant the next morning?
Yes.
All right. Your Honor, would you assist me with the lights? Dr. Rao, let me show you first, state 79. Was that one of the photographs from the scene that you were provided?
Yes.
And state 76, was that a photograph from the scene you were provided?
Yes.
Let me show you states 57, where you also provided that photograph.
Yes.
All right. Your Honor, may I approach the witness? Yes, you may. Dr. Rao, let me give you this pointer. You just press that button. If you would explain for the members of the jury where the lacerations are located that you observed and that were referred to in the family clinic report.
Okay, so we have one small injury right there and one injury right there where the blood is streaming from. So these were the two lacerations.
All right. In the Altamont Family Clinic report, were you also provided with the measurements of each of those lacerations?
Yes.
And are either of those lacerations life-threatening?
No.
Why not?
Because they were so minor that the individual who examined and treated Mr. Zimmerman told him that the sutures were not required. So she put a Band-Aid on each of them, and that was the extent of the treatment.
All right. Are there also some contusions or a contusion on the back of the defendant's head?
Yes,
And can you show the members of the jury where that is in the photograph?
right there.
And is that a life-threatening injury?
No.
Why not?
Well, the reason I asked for everything was I then looked at the entire case file, and when he walked from the police car to the police department to be booked, he was not incapacitated in any way. He was very alert and walking, in pace with the officers.
Are the injuries that you observed to the back of the defendant's head consistent with his head having made contact with a concrete surface?
Yes.
And why do you say that?
So, I've looked at the other areas that were photographed, and they have a sort of a pattern that were punctate, meaning that there were little areas which came into contact with a rough surface. But so looking at the concrete area, again, the reenactment that I was given, it's consistent with his head having come into contact with that rough surface.
And are the injuries on the back of the defendant's head consistent with one strike against a concrete surface?
Yes.
And why do you say that?
Because if you hit the head one time, it is consistent with having gotten those two injuries at that one time. Because it's an area where it is protruding, because the head is protruding, because the head is a round surface, and so that one impact could result in the two lacerations that you see.
And are the injuries you observed to the back of the defendant's head consistent with his head having been slammed repeatedly into a concrete surface?
Okay, so I'm going to give you my what I think based on the dictionary definition of slammed is. And there are two definitions from two different dictionaries.
Let me object, Your Honor. If she's going to define a word from a dictionary, that would be hearsay.
Please approach.